Ever notice how sometimes the people who are always helping others, putting everyone else first, they don't always end up on top?
Yeah, it is kind of a head scratcher, isn't it?
Like you'd think, good karma and all that. Shouldn't they be the ones succeeding the most?
You'd think so, right?
hmm
But it turns out it's not always the case.
Today, we are diving deep into Adam Grant's Give and Take.
We're going to unpack some research and stories about these different ways people interact, see how it all plays out in the real world.
See if we can figure out why sometimes being a giver can backfire.
Exactly. And more importantly, what can we learn from this? How can we make sure our own good intentions actually lead to good outcomes, both for ourselves and for the people we're trying to help?
And for this deep dive, we've got some great sources you sent our way.
A lot of research, some really interesting case studies, and even personal anecdotes should give us a good, well-rounded view.
Absolutely. So Adam Grant, in Give and Take, talks about these three main reciprocity styles: givers, takers, and matchers.
Right? Most people sort of fall into one of these categories.
Yeah, like a default setting for how you approach interactions.
Givers, obviously, they're all about helping others.
Right.
They don't necessarily expect a quid pro quo.
They just genuinely like to help.
Then you've got the takers. I think we all know a few of those.
Oh, yeah.
They're mostly looking out for number one. What can they get out of the situation?
And often at the expense of others.
Exactly. And then the matchers. They're all about fairness. Keep things balanced. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
It's like keeping a mental tally of who owes who a favor.
Pretty much. And it's interesting because, as we'll see, none of these styles is inherently good or bad. It all depends on the context.
Right. And how you use it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some of this research and see what it tells us about these different styles in action.
All right, so let's start with this paradox of the giver, because the initial findings are kind of surprising. Like, there's this study of med students.
Oh, yeah, the one where the most helpful students actually got the lowest grades.
Exactly. They were spending so much time helping their classmates, sharing notes, explaining concepts, that their own studies suffered.
They were basically boosting everyone else's performance, but at a cost to their own.
Right. And it wasn't just in school. The same pattern popped up in sales. The givers in the study, they were bringing in way less revenue than the takers and matchers.
Sometimes like 2.5 times less, which is a huge difference.
Yeah, because they were so focused on the customer's needs, making sure they were happy, that they weren't as aggressive about closing deals.
They were putting the relationship first, even if it meant missing out on immediate profits.
So it makes you think, maybe being too nice can actually hold you back.
Right. There's got to be a balance. You can't be so focused on helping others that you completely neglect your own goals.
But then you hear stories like David Hornick's, this venture capitalist.
Oh, he's a great example of a giver who's incredibly successful.
Yeah, and get this, early on, he actually lost out on a deal because the entrepreneur thought he was too nice. Yeah. The entrepreneur was worried that Hornick wouldn't push him hard enough, wouldn't be challenging enough.
Wow. So being a giver was actually seen as a negative in that case.
It was. But here's the thing. Hornick's giving approach actually became his secret weapon in the long run. He built this incredibly reputation for being supportive and generous.
He focused on building genuine relationships with the entrepreneurs he worked with, rather than just chasing the next big deal.
And that led to more opportunities because people trusted him. They knew he had their best interests at heart.
It's like that saying, your network is your net worth.
Exactly. And get this, most venture capitalists have a deal closing rate of around 50%.
Which is pretty good, considering how competitive that field is.
Right. But Hornick, his rate was 89%.
Seriously, that's almost unheard of.
Out of 28 term sheets he offered over 11 years, only 3 were rejected.
Wow. So even though he may have lost out on that one deal early on because he was perceived as too nice,
In the long run, his giving approach more than paid off.
that's a pretty powerful argument for the long-term benefits of being a giver.
Right, but then you have someone like Samson. This guy was known for being incredibly ethical, deeply concerned for others.
Sounds like a good guy.
He was, but in the world of politics, that was actually seen as a weakness.
Yeah, how so?
Well, he was a public defender, and there was this one case where he actually handed it over to another lawyer.
Why would he do that?
Because he genuinely believed the defendant was guilty. He couldn't bring himself to defend someone he knew had committed a crime.
Wow. Talk about integrity.
Right, and he was also known for not being very ambitious. He wasn't driven by power or status. He just wanted to do what he thought was right.
Which, again, sounds admirable.
It is, but in the cutthroat world of politics, it made him seem weak, like he didn't have the fire in his belly to fight for what he believed in.
He was up against an opponent who was known for being a fierce debater.
Yeah, and that opponent actually won the election. And some people suggested that the opponent just had more real talent and power.
So even though Samson was seen as a good person, his giving nature was ultimately perceived as a liability in that particular environment.
It was, which shows that the effectiveness of a giver style can really depend on the context.
Right, you have to be aware of the environment you're operating in.
But then you have someone like Abraham Lincoln. He operated as a giver in the highest stakes leadership role you can imagine.
President during the Civil War. Talk about pressure.
Right. And what did he do? He brought his biggest rivals into his cabinet.
Seriously, why would he do that?
Because he knew the country needed the best people in those roles, regardless of their personal feelings towards him.
That's a pretty selfless move.
It was, and some of those rivals initially really looked down on him. Edwin Stanton, for example, had once called Lincoln a gawky, long-armed ape.
Wow.
But through working closely together, Stanton came to deeply respect Lincoln. He even called him the most perfect ruler of men the world has ever seen.
So, Lincoln's giving approach, his willingness to put the needs of the country above his own ego, ultimately earned him the respect of even his harshest critics.
It did. And it shows that even in the most challenging circumstances, operating as a giver can be a source of strength.
Definitely. It all comes back to that med school study. Remember how the givers initially had the lowest grades?
Yeah.
Well, their performance actually improved over time. By their second year, they'd caught up. By their sixth and seventh years, they were surpassing their peers.
So while their giving might have initially held them back a little, in the long run, it became a huge asset.
It's like they were building up social capital. They were creating a network of people who were willing to help them out.
And as their careers progressed, those relationships became more and more valuable.
Exactly. It's like investing in the future.
Then there's the story of Peter Audit, the financial advisor. He had this client who was going through a tough time financially.
And instead of just doing the bare minimum, he went above and beyond to help them out.
He made them this incredibly generous offer, way more than what their agreement stipulated.
Really? What did he do?
Well, the details aren't important, but the point is, he put the client's needs ahead of his own potential profit.
And what happened?
It actually ended up being incredibly lucrative for him in the long run. The client was so grateful for his help that they became a loyal, long-term client, and their fees increased significantly over time.
So it was a win-win. The client got the help they needed, and Peter ended up benefiting as well.
Exactly. But there's also a cautionary side to Peter's story. He was actually exploited by some takers at one point, almost lost his whole business.
Oh, wow. That's rough.
It was, and it shows that being a giver doesn't mean being a pushover. You have to be smart about it.
Right. You can't let people take advantage of you.
We'll talk more about that later, but for now, let's dive a little deeper into these different reciprocity styles. We've talked about givers, who are all about helping others without expecting anything specific in return.
They just find it intrinsically rewarding.
Right. Then there are the takers, who are primarily focused on their own interests, often at the expense of others.
They're always looking for an angle. How can they get ahead, even if it means stepping on someone else?
And then there are the matchers. They operate on this principle of fairness. You do something for me, I'll do something for you.
They want to keep things balanced.
Now, these aren't fixed categories. You might find yourself acting like a giver in some situations, a matcher in others, and even a taker sometimes.
Yeah, it depends on the context and who you're interacting with.
But most people have a dominant style, like a default setting.
Right. And what's interesting is that these styles are often driven by different values.
Takers, for example, they tend to value things like wealth, power, pleasure, winning.
It's all about coming out on top, being better than everyone else.
Whereas givers, they value helpfulness, responsibility, social justice, compassion.
They're more concerned with the well-being of others, making a positive impact on the world.
And there's actually research that suggests that certain cultures tend to endorse giver values more strongly than others.
Really?
That's fascinating.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the specific country data in our sources.
Okay. But it definitely suggests that the cultural context can play a role in how these different reciprocity styles manifest.
Absolutely. So how can we spot a taker? Because they're not always obvious.
Right. Sometimes they can be pretty good at disguising themselves.
Take Ken Lay, for example, the former CDO of Enron.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He was a classic faker, a taker masquerading as a giver.
He seemed very charming, charismatic. He did a lot of public service.
But behind the scenes, he was using company resources for his own personal enrichment.
He was taking out huge loans from Enron, using company staff for personal errands, even making sure his family members benefited from company funds.
And then, of course, there were those allegations about him selling off a ton of his Enron stock right before the company collapsed.
Yep. Talk about a red flag.
So how can you tell if someone's a genuine giver or just a taker in disguise? Well, one thing to look for is this phenomenon called lecking.
Lecking? What's that?
It's a term borrowed from animal behavior. Basically, it's about how males of certain species try to attract females by putting on these elaborate displays.
Okay. And how does that relate to CEOs?
Well, some researchers studied the language used by CEOs in their annual reports, and they found that taker CEOs tend to engage in a lot of self-promotion.
They use a lot of first-person singular pronouns. I, me, mine.
It's like they're trying to take all the credit for the company's success.
Like they're the only ones responsible.
Exactly. And in one study, almost 40% of the first-person pronouns used by extreme takers were singular.
So paying attention to how people talk about themselves can actually be a pretty good indicator of their reciprocity style.
It can. And luckily, in today's world, it's actually becoming easier to spot takers.
How so?
Because of the internet, social media.
All right. Everything's out in the open now.
Exactly. You can go on LinkedIn, Facebook, see who people are connected with, how they interact with others.
It makes it a lot harder to hide your true colors.
And some companies are actually using this information in their hiring process.
Really?
Yeah, Groupon, for example, they check out candidates' social media profiles as part of their vetting process.
That's smart, because it gives you a more well-rounded view of the person.
It does, and it makes it harder for takers to slip through the cracks.
Right. Because if you've got a history of bad behavior, it's going to be pretty hard to hide that online.
On the flip side, you have someone like Adam Rifkin, who's known for being a master networker.
Oh, yeah. He's a great example of a giver who uses his network to help others.
And he does it genuinely. He's not keeping score. He's not trying to get something out of it.
He just enjoys connecting people and helping them succeed.
Exactly. And it's interesting because when he first moved to Silicon Valley, he was actually pretty shy.
Really?
Yeah. And he saw giving as a way to build relationships.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you're not naturally outgoing, being helpful can be a great way to connect with people.
It can. And through his consistent generosity, Rifkin has built this massive network of connections.
And within that network, he has a lot of what are called dormant ties.
Dormant ties, what are those?
Basically, it's people you were once close to, but have lost touch with over time.
Oh, right, like old friends from college, former colleagues.
Exactly. And research suggests that we actually accumulate a ton of these dormant ties throughout our lives, thousands of them.
Wow, so we've all got this huge network of potential connections that we're not even tapping into.
That's right. And what's fascinating is that there's real value in reconnecting with these dormant ties.
There is.
Yeah. There was a study where executives were asked to reconnect with people from their past. And almost all of those rekindled connections ended up providing significant value.
So even though you might not have spoken to someone in years, there's still potential there.
Absolutely.
Huh?
But how people approach reconnecting with those dormant ties often depends on their reciprocity style.
How so?
Well, matchers can be hesitant to reach out
Why is that?
because they're so focused on keeping things even. If they feel like they owe someone a favor or haven't been in touch for a while, they might feel awkward about reaching out.
It's like they're worried about upsetting the balance.
Right. But givers, they don't have that same hesitation because they're not keeping score.
So they're more likely to reach out just to say hi, see how someone's doing.
Exactly. And because they have a history of being helpful, people are usually happy to hear from them.
Like Rifkin, he actually focuses more on reconnecting with dormant ties than on building new relationships.
Wow. That's interesting.
It is. And he's had a lot of success with it. He even reconnected with Evan Williams, one of the co-founders of Twitter, after years of no contact.
And Williams agreed to speak at an event he was organizing.
Yep. So it really shows that your past generosity can come back to you in unexpected ways.
Definitely. And it all goes back to that idea of creating a network of goodwill.
Rifkin's story also shows how givers can create value for others by connecting them with the right people, like the story of Raymond Roof, this struggling entrepreneur.
What happened there?
Rifkin met him at a party, and Roof was pitching his business idea.
And being the giver he is, Rifkin offered to help.
He did. He gave Roof feedback on his idea, spent hours mentoring him, and then, crucially, introduced him to a venture capitalist who ended up funding his company.
So Rifkin's generosity directly led to Riff's success.
It did, and that's the thing about givers. They're not just thinking about themselves, they're thinking about how they can help others succeed.
It's like they're playing a different game. They're not just trying to win, they're trying to create a win-win situation for everyone involved.
And it's contagious. When people experience Rifkin's generosity, they're more likely to pay it forward.
It's like he's creating a ripple effect of giving throughout his network.
Exactly. So we've seen how giving can lead to success. But there's also this concern about productivity.
Right, the idea that givers might actually be less productive than other reciprocity styles because they spend so much time helping others.
Like, there was the study of engineers, and it found that while the givers were generally well-liked and respected,
They actually produced less individual output than the matchers.
which makes sense. If you're constantly stopping to help your colleagues, it's going to take away from your own work time.
But here's the interesting thing. The engineers who were the most productive were actually those who gave the most.
Really?
Yeah, the ones who consistently gave more than they received.
How is that possible?
Well, it seems like by constantly being helpful, they built up a lot of trust and goodwill within their team. And when they needed help, people were more than willing to return the favor.
So it's like by giving more, they actually ended up getting more in return.
Exactly. And it's not just about getting favors back, it's also about building a reputation for being helpful.
Which can lead to more opportunities in the long run.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about collaboration and creativity.
Because this is where givers can really shine.
Like George Meyer, for example. He's this incredibly successful comedy writer.
Won tons of Emmys, worked on some of the biggest shows in TV history.
And he's known for being an amazing collaborator.
Yeah, he's not just funny himself. He has this knack for bringing out the best in other people.
He's like a genius maker rather
Yeah.
than just a genius.
Exactly. And this is something Liz Wiseman talks about in her research. She distinguishes between geniuses and genial makers.
Geniuses, they're often more like takers. They want all the credit. They drain intelligence and energy from the people around them.
Genius makers, on the other hand, they're like givers. They use their own intelligence to amplify the skills and knowledge of others.
They create an environment where everyone can thrive.
And that leads to greater creativity and innovation.
Absolutely. It's the opposite of that lone genius myth,
Right. And it's interesting to contrast George Meyer with someone like Frank Lloyd Wright.
the architect.
Yeah, he was brilliant, incredibly creative, but he was also known for being pretty difficult to work with. Yeah, he was reportedly quite exploitative of his apprentices, even allegedly charged his own son for his upbringing.
Wow. That's rough.
It is. And some people suggest that his taker mentality actually held him back in his career.
It's like his inability to collaborate prevented him from achieving even greater success.
And it's not just anecdotal. There's research on star investment analysts and cardiac surgeons that shows similar patterns.
They might be incredibly talented individually, but when they move to a new environment, their performance often drops.
Because their success was dependent on the specific team they were a part of.
Right. It shows that even if you're brilliant, you can't do it alone.
Collaboration is key.
And George Meyer really understood that.
Yeah.
After he left Saturday Night Live, he actually reached out to former colleagues to work on a new project.
Even though it wasn't as high profile as SNL.
He recognized that his own success was intertwined with the success of others.
And that by putting the group's interests first, he'd ultimately benefit as well.
Exactly. Now, all this talk about collaboration highlights the importance of recognizing the contributions of others.
Like Jonas Salk, the guy who developed the polio vaccine.
He's a hero, right? Saved millions of lives.
He did. But at the press conference announcing the vaccine, he failed to acknowledge the contributions of others.
Seriously?
Yeah. He didn't mention the foundational research that paved the way for his work.
Or the scientists in his own lab
Eh.
who played key roles in the development of the vaccine.
Nope. And it really hurt his reputation.
Wow. So even someone who's achieved something as amazing as curing polio can fall victim to this trap.
It's this thing called the responsibility bias, our tendency to overestimate our own contributions.
Because we have more insight into our own efforts, we know how much work we put in.
Exactly. But the good news is we can overcome this bias
Oh.
by consciously making an effort to recognize the contributions of others.
Like actively thinking about what other people have done before focusing on our own role.
Exactly. And there's actually research that shows that when employees are prompted to think about how their managers have helped them.
They rate their manager's contributions much higher.
So it's a simple shift in perspective, but it can make a big difference.
Definitely. Now, to really help others effectively, It's crucial to develop the skill of perspective taking.
Being able to see things from another person's point of view.
And that ability starts developing early on. There's this classic experiment with toddlers and their preference for goldfish crackers versus broccoli.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about that one.
Even though the toddlers themselves preferred the crackers, when the researcher expressed a preference for broccoli.
The older toddlers would actually offer the researcher the broccoli.
Exactly. They were trying to give the researcher what they thought the researcher would want.
Even though it wasn't what they themselves wanted.
It shows this developing capacity for empathy.
And that empathy is essential for givers to be effective. Like in the story of Beth Trainum.
She's the one who struggled with accounting, right?
Yeah. She was having a really hard time with it, and she's about to give up on the CPA exam.
But then she had this amazing teacher, C.J. Skender.
Who believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself.
And that made all the difference.
It did. Skender had this way of seeing potential in people, even if they didn't have the best grades or the most impressive resume.
He looked for motivation, work ethic.
And he was often right. Like with Reggie Love, the Duke basketball player who needed to pass accounting to graduate.
And Skender saw something in him.
He did. And that belief helped Love to succeed, not just in accounting, but in his whole career.
It's amazing how much impact a teacher can have.
It is. But givers, precisely because they're so good at seeing potential, can sometimes fall into the trap of overinvesting.
What do you mean?
Well, they might pour a ton of time and energy into helping someone who ultimately doesn't have the aptitude or the grit to succeed.
Like Skender himself, he wrote over 100 recommendation letters for one student who ended up not getting into any grad programs.
Ouch.
Right.
That's got to be frustrating.
It is. And we see similar mistakes in professional sports, like those famous NBA draft busts.
Where teams passed on future superstars?
And part of the problem is this tendency for people, especially takers, to double down on their initial assessment.
They don't want to admit they were wrong.
Even if it means sticking with a bad decision.
Right. And it's interesting because Stu Inman, the guy who made some of those infamous draft picks,
He actually changed his approach later on.
he did. He started focusing more on players' psychological makeup,
Things like selflessness, perseverance, coachability.
and those qualities turned out to be better predictors of success than just raw talent.
It's almost like he was looking for givers.
Now, let's talk about something that might seem a little counterintuitive. The power of powerless communication.
Powerless communication, what's that?
Basically, it's about communicating in a way that doesn't come across as overly assertive or dominant.
Like asking questions instead of making statements.
Exactly. Or admitting weaknesses, seeking advice.
It seems like that would make you seem less competent.
You'd think so. But for givers, it can actually be really effective.
How so?
Well, takers are often afraid to show any vulnerability. They want to appear strong and in control.
Right. Because they're worried about losing their perceived power.
Exactly. But givers, they're more comfortable admitting they don't have all the answers.
And that can actually make them more relatable and trustworthy.
There's a classic study that shows this. When someone who was already perceived as knowledgeable admitted a mistake,
They were actually liked more than if they had pretended to be perfect.
but if someone who was already seen as incompetent made a mistake, it just reinforced that perception.
So it's about finding that balance between confidence and humility.
Right. And this principle applies in a lot of different contexts, like in sales.
Oh, yeah. There's research that shows that givers tend to be more successful in sales than takers or matchers.
And a big part of that is their willingness to ask questions.
To really understand the customer's needs.
And this isn't just true in customer service roles. There's research in insurance and pharmaceuticals that shows the same thing.
So a genuine desire to help can actually be a really effective sales strategy.
It can. And asking questions can be incredibly persuasive.
Because it makes people feel like they're coming to the decision on their own.
It's not about pushing a product or an idea on them. It's about helping them to discover what they really want.
And even tentative language can be effective.
Like using qualifiers, admitting uncertainty.
Yeah. It can make you seem less intimidating, more approachable.
And that can be really valuable in certain situations, like for a lawyer trying to connect with a jury.
Right. If you come across as too confident, too arrogant, it can backfire.
Whereas if you're a little more humble, a little more relatable.
People are more likely to trust you.
Now,
Oh,
takers often use powerful speech to try to project an image of competence.
Even if they don't actually have the expertise to back it up.
And while that might work in the short term, it can actually be detrimental to team performance in the long run.
It's better to create an environment where people feel comfortable asking questions and sharing their ideas.
Even if it means admitting that you don't have all the answers.
Absolutely. And Annie's story is a great example of how seeking advice can be beneficial.
She was facing a tricky situation at work, and instead of demanding her way,
She went to her boss and asked for advice.
and it ended up being really helpful. She got new information, a different perspective,
And her boss got to see the situation from her point of view.
which led to a better solution for everyone involved.
So seeking advice can be a win-win.
It can. But now let's address something that a lot of people worry about when it comes to being a giver: burnout.
Yeah. The idea that if you're constantly helping others, you're eventually going to burn out.
But the research actually suggests that burnout among givers isn't about how much you give.
It's about whether you feel like your giving is making a difference.
There was this study of university fundraising callers. When they were given the opportunity to actually meet the students who were benefiting from their work,
Their motivation and effectiveness went way up.
and the same thing happened with radiologists. When they were shown pictures of the patients whose scans they were reviewing.
They were more thorough and accurate in their diagnoses.
So it's about seeing the impact of your giving.
Feeling like you're making a real difference.
And one way to do that is to chunk your giving.
Chunking.
Basically, it means focusing your efforts on specific areas where you can see the results.
Instead of spreading yourself too thin.
Exactly. And there's this concept called the 100-hour rule, which suggests that volunteering about 2 hours a week can actually increase your happiness.
Without leading to burnout.
Exactly. And Sean Haggerty, he found that giving back through education programs at his work actually energized him.
So it didn't drain him, it actually gave him more energy.
It did.
Yeah.
And that's because he was giving in a way that aligned with his values.
Right. So it's not just about how much you give, it's about how you give.
And givers who are more strategic about their giving, who set boundaries and take care of themselves.
They're less likely to burn out.
They are. And here's another interesting finding. Research suggests that people who give more to charity actually tend to have higher incomes. Yeah. And one possible explanation is that giving boosts happiness and motivation.
Which then leads to greater productivity and success.
It's like a positive feedback loop.
That's pretty cool. But there is a potential downside to being agreeable and giving.
What's that?
Research has shown that those types of people can sometimes experience lower salary increases and slower promotions.
Because they're not as assertive about advocating for themselves.
Exactly. So how can givers protect themselves from being taken advantage of?
Well, one important skill is sincerity screening.
Sincerity screening. What's that?
It's about being able to tell the difference between genuine givers and those who are just pretending.
The fakersies.
Exactly. And givers are actually pretty good at this.
How so?
Because they're naturally more attuned to other people's emotions and motivations.
They can pick up on subtle cues that might betray a taker's true intentions.
Like Jason Geller at Deloitte, he has this intuitive way of spotting takers during mentoring conversations.
What does he look for?
He pays attention to whether they're genuinely interested in learning and growing.
Or if they're just trying to use the mentoring relationship to get ahead.
Exactly. And then there's Peter, who we talked about earlier. He learned to adopt a trust but verify approach.